Good evening, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for watching the channel. I'm with a special guest today, my good friend Tom. The reason I had Tom on, guys, is because he is a professional pond fisherman. He is elite. And tonight we're going to be talking a little bit about the gear that he uses because it's very different than what I do. And I know I've already shared with y'all the perspective of how I throw big baits and my swim baits, and actually most of my gear and fishing lures. But Tom has a very different perspective in what he does. So right off the bat, I'm gonna kind of break it open here. Tom is a braid to leader fisherman.
Yep.
Big time no go. But what do you use, Tom? Like, just give us a quick introduction on what setups you use, rod, reel, and why it works for you in terms of braid.
Sure. So reels are pretty much the same reels that everyone else would use. I use a lot of Shimano. Speed
So
I use,
still same speed.
yeah, speed I use mostly 7-to-1, 8-to-1 gear ratio. I don't think I own anything slower than a 7-to-1.
Nice.
Even for
Okay, cool.
cranking.
Well, we agree there.
I Yeah, I don't own any slow reels. Even like spinner baits, cranking, it's all 7-to-1.
Nice.
Top water, all the same deal. Jerk bait. I think I throw a jerk bait on an 7-to-1 or an 8-to-1.
Okay.
So it's all fast. Everything, all my reels are fast. So the reels, we probably agree on the same stuff. I know you have a little bit higher end gear, but uh, it's all, like I said, all the same speeds.
I don't think it matters a whole ton. Maybe a little bit smoother,
Yeah,
a little bit further casting distance, but
doesn't make a huge difference
it
in
doesn't
the
make a
in the
huge
fishing.
difference. No.
Um, the rods. Well, I guess let me get into rods because that is something that I do a little bit different. I like a either a lighter power or a more moderate action um, for my reaction bait specifically. So if I'm out there throwing a spinner bait, I throw it on a medium heavy. What do you throw it on, Cam?
For a spinner bait, I still
Yeah,
throw a
spinner
medium
bait,
heavy. I
medium
still throw
heavy.
medium heavy.
Okay, so we probably throw pretty comparable gear there. Um, the biggest, I guess, the biggest downside that I see with braid is it's also the upside in that there's no stretch. And so if you don't adapt to that properly, then you're going to end up bending out hooks. I probably use a lot of the same gear that I we probably use a lot of the same gear for throwing different stuff. I set my drag a little bit looser. So if I know I'm throwing with something with light hooks, I'll set the drag loose. Um, so that it has a little bit of give there. Most of what I do, at least from a pond perspective, I throw heavy line because I have 12 inches visibility. So I throw heavy
What is
line,
heavy line?
20-pound leader. I throw 30, pretty much everything I throw is 30-pound braid to 20-pound leader.
Okay.
My standard braid diameter is going to be 30-pound for pretty much everything except for like extreme applications. So my 30 is my all around, 30-pound all around. I'll throw spinner baits, jigs, pretty much any sort of top water reaction style bait. I'll throw on Texas rig. I'll throw 30-pound spinner bait, 30-pound. The only things I go lighter for, throw 20-pound for my crank bait fishing, and I'll go heavier if I'm truly flipping stuff. Or
And then you'll
punching.
just go straight braid.
Yeah, I'll go probably 65.
Okay.
Um,
And
but
you
for
bring up a really good point there is for you, 30-pound braid across the board, you
everything.
can change leaders. So you don't need a
Correct.
ton of rods. So I think that's your versatility there. You coming from a pond background, uh, you can bring two, three rods and then, maybe a couple spools of fishing line and change literally your entirely different lures and presentation with the same rods by just
Correct.
switching out. I don't know what leader length do you use, 10, 15 feet?
Uh, I usually I will use usually about a 6 foot leader
Okay.
is what I'll tie on. Now, as I cut off baits and tie on new ones, I end up with probably a 4 or 3 foot leader eventually.
Okay.
And then once I get down to about 2 feet, I'll retie on a new 6 foot leader.
Okay.
I'll do that for like when I'm pond fishing and throwing, like I say, I usually have 6 or 12 inches of visibility. So I use the leader more as a shock absorber than as a like for its
Not for
invisible
like
level.
visibility.
Not for visibility. I'm not worried about visibility at all. Now, when I come fish Lanier, I will tie on a much longer leader. I'll tie a 10, 15-foot fluoro leader, where most of my pond fishing, almost all my pond fishing, is a 20-pound, 6 foot or so mono leader. I'll use mono specifically for this
Ah,
fish.
okay. So you're bringing in a whole another type of fishing line here.
Right.
We'll definitely talk about that here in a bit, but we kind of flew by right off the bat. You mentioned rod and hooks bending out, and I
Yeah.
was actually kind of surprised that you used a medium heavy. Normally for me, and just to give a quick background, I've tried the braid the leader route. I've had it recommended to me by some very talented fishermen, even guides. And this is a cool thing about fishing is what works for one may not work for another. And so it's very cool to just unpack and dissect different ways of doing things. But I've tried the braid the leader, and same thing like you mentioned a little bit earlier, bending out hooks, a little bit overpowered. There's no stretch, and we'll dive deeper into all of those, I guess, side by side comparisons. But I'm kind of surprised, and walk me through why don't you like go one power lighter in terms of rods?
I mean, I can.
You just don't
I
like
can
it?
go a power lighter. I like to have a little bit more control over the fish. So
Okay, so it's a control thing.
yeah, so I could go a power lighter and it'd be fine. I've thrown a spinner bait on same spinner bait I throw on my medium heavy fast action. I've thrown it on my now what's my square bill rod, which is a medium moderate fast, and it works just fine. I just have to play them a little bit more that way.
Okay.
I can still get good hook sets on it, no problem. Rod loads up great. I guess that specific rod is a little bit slower, so I feel like I get more accurate casts with a faster action.
Okay.
So I that's part of the reason why I do that. I guess I'm not super worried about bending out hooks because
Yeah, so let's talk
I go
about
to a
that now.
heavier hook. Yeah, let's talk about that.
Yeah.
I usually go to a heavier hook. So most of the
Like
hooks
a
that I use
2X or 3X or what?
for are you talking about treble hooks
Yeah,
or
let's start treble hooks.
yeah, so treble hooks I'll go to like probably a 2X and I use a short shank EWG as opposed to a round bend. I think even more than the gauge of the hook, that EWG helps. I don't think they get the same leverage on it to bend out hooks the way that they can a round bend treble.
I
So I
I
really,
I 100% agree with that.
yeah, I really like that short shank. And if you're going to an EWG, you do need to go short shank, just so your hooks don't get tangled together.
Makes
But
sense.
I like that. I like that style of hook, and that I don't bend out a whole lot of hooks. Now, when I crankbait fish, and that's most of my treble hook baits are crankbaits, square bills. I will set my drag a little bit looser. So I'm not trying to winch in those fish all the time. I will play those fish a little bit more on a treble hook versus a single like jig style hook.
Okay, so that does make a difference in how you fight the fish. Because
For
I
sure.
know generally you like to tighten your drag a good bit, if I'm
Oh
not
yeah.
mistaken, and keep them coming to the boat. And I've
Yep.
heard
Keep them
that,
moving.
yeah, keep water ski them, right? Yeah. So I've heard it. I've heard a lot of guys say that, and it works apparently for them. I mean, I've watched you do it, and it seems to work. But when I do something like that, or I put braid the leader in my hand, lock down my drag, I tend to lose a lot of fish. It's just not what I'm confident with, and the same problems we've discussed, recently here. I bent out a lot of hooks. I had a lot of fish throw the baits because I would rip a massive hole in their mouth when I would set the hook and then
Sure.
try to play them like I'm used to versus keep them coming and lose fish that way.
Sure.
So it definitely makes sense. It 100% makes sense. Just it doesn't work for me. So this is why I wanted to have him on, obviously, and explain for you guys watching out there. Braid the leader can be good, and I don't mean to bash it. It just doesn't work for me. And I've ended up going to uh, pretty much standard, standard rod power across the board for what I'm using. So I guess we talked about here. I thought that was going to be a little different, but same thing: spinnerbait, medium heavy; jig rod, medium heavy; crankbaits,
Jig, I go
medium.
heavy. Jig, I go to a heavy rod.
Okay, okay.
Yeah.
Uh, and then I use
Which I guess
floor.
depends what kind of jig. Like if I'm throwing a finesse jig, yeah, sure, I'll throw that on a medium heavy.
Okay.
But any sort of like flipping jig, kind of anything with an archy style
Oh
head,
yeah. See,
for the
so
most part,
yeah,
I'll
when I
throw that
when
on
I'm
heavy.
jig fishing, I'm like fishing on deep rocky points, no
Sure.
minimal structure. I'm not pulling them out of thick mats and vegetation or grass or trees or anything like that. So again, different types of fisheries is where we learned, and it is what it is. But yeah, I use the fluorocarbon. I love fluorocarbon. That's kind of what I've said on it over the years. I don't have to go to bigger hooks. I like to play my fish more. I grew up on deep clear water reservoirs fishing, so for me, it wasn't necessarily an issue of letting the fish swim around. I have that luxury of letting them just swim around and tire themselves out before I get them to the boat. And so there was really no need for me to lock down my drag and go haywire and try and get them to the boat. And like I said, I've had a lot of problems with it in the past. So again, that works for me. Tom does the braid the leader for fishing, and it seems to work well for you. I mean, you land a lot of your fish that you hook, so I got to give you props to that because I'd be pitching a fit. I'd be losing all sorts of fish. So, all right, let's jump into now, and I've kind of run through a list of comparing braid versus fluorocarbon. And again, we've already touched on a little bit of these, but first one's just kind of running through a list I made here, and then we can kind of unpack what we want to. But braid, backlash a ton, especially if it's windy. Is that my fault, or is that something you experience as well?
I guess it's hard to say because I don't throw fluorocarbon at all, so I don't throw straight fluorocarbon at all, so I don't know if I don't have a frame of reference for how much I would backlash throwing fluoro versus braid.
Okay.
Um, I used to throw fluorocarbon. I don't think it's a huge, I don't know, I don't have a huge difference in backlashing with braid.
So you're
Um,
probably used to it.
yeah, I'm used to it.
Yeah, I wrote that one down because for me, I had braid on my top water rods,
Sure.
and I've recently switched to mono, and I
You
love
went
it
to
way better.
mono?
Yeah, I love
Ugh,
it way better.
interesting.
It's way better. I don't know why I didn't do it sooner. But anyway, with braid, those were my only two braid rods. And for me, every time I picked that rod up, a school fish would be busting, and every time backlash, backlash, backlash. So for me, it was just frustrating because it seemed like half the casts, especially into wind, were very tough to control with braid. And even if you do everything correctly, sometimes it's dug in on itself from the last fish you caught or from getting wet and then dry, and it kind of sticks together a little bit. So you can do everything perfectly, it seems, with braid, and it can still backlash. And
So sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. That's a good
oh,
point. When I load up my reels with braid, like with like a new empty reel, and I put braid on it, I'll
yep,
put on a backer of monofilament, and then I'll tie my braid to that mono backer, um, and I will wind it on tight. Like I'll wind it on under tension for that reason, so that it doesn't dig into itself. So that is
okay.
a good point, and I do that intentionally so that I don't have that issue. Um, so that is a good
Maybe I need
point.
to
So
do that.
maybe that's part of the problem that you're having is if you spool it up um, like a normal line, yeah, I could definitely see you running into that problem because it is so
So
thin.
it just keeps it from spinning, correct? If I understand that correctly, from spinning on the reel,
The backer,
the backing.
the backing helps it keep from spinning on the reel. That's why I do
Okay.
that.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a big reason why I do that. And then the winding it on tight is so that it doesn't dig it into itself.
Okay. Yep. And don't get too discouraged here. I have a list of all of the downfalls of braid, but I have a list of all of the problems with fluoro too. So bear with me. But the next thing I have is casting distance. Everyone says you can cast further with braid. Before I jump into my opinion on that, give me yours.
I think it depends on I mean, I've never gone out and measured it, but I would totally believe that you could. It's thinner. It's like a 20 pound or a 20 pound braid that I use for my crankbait fishing is like an 8 pound equivalent diameter for a fluorocarbon. The 30 pound is probably equivalent to like a 10 or a 12 pound fluoro.
Right.
So it is notably thinner than like a 14 or a 17 pound fluoro that you'd use for a lot of this heavy stuff. So yeah, I believe that you could cast farther with it. Now you use a lot of light line as it is, so I don't know that we probably see a big difference there.
Okay. Yeah, my whole point was that is that I always hear people say you can cast further with braid, and I think from a scientific perspective, I think that's accurate. But I think when you go out on the lake and you add wind and you add chop and resistance of the lure and all of those things and the skill level of a fisherman, I think most times, I would say most times, I would agree with that, that you can cast just as far, if not further, with fluorocarbon or monofilament. And again, I don't know. We recently fished together. I mean, we went out on some brutal windy days,
Oh,
and
totally.
I didn't see a difference. I didn't think, I didn't think braid was helping you cast further in the wind or anything like that. Am
Yeah.
I correct? Or
I think the difference in like you might get a measurable difference, but the difference in fishing is pretty negligible. I mean,
correct? That yeah,
there's very few times that, at least for me, there's very few times I'm making like a full out bomber cast as far as I can. Now, if I'm crankbait fishing, sure, like maybe you get another 5 or 10 feet, maybe, and I don't
yeah,
know that that even makes a huge difference because as long as your strike zones are the same size, regardless of if you're throwing one line or another.
yeah. I agree, and that's your pond fishing background as well. You're more target fishing and roll
Right,
casting and
right.
pretty close to the bank. Where for me, I actually do cast at 95 to 100% of casting distance most of the time in open water. You're making long casts across points and just trying to make as long a presentation as possible because these fish are moving across large areas of water very rapidly, chasing the herring that are moving. And so sometimes they may come up, a good 40 yards from you, and you have to hit that. So for me, like I said, with braid, in my experience, it seemed for me I would just end up backlashing, and then I couldn't even get my bait there. So I'm willing to give up. Maybe if it was a little further, I'm willing to give up those backlashes for a few extra yards to just go to something that casts a little easier for me because I can still fire it out there pretty far.
Definitely. What size mono are you throwing on your top water rods?
15.
15.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. 15-pound trilene big game, which I
That's
didn't
what I
believe
use for
at
my
first.
leaders. Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Yeah. That,
I use a lot of big game for my mono leaders. Again, because I don't care about
yeah.
diameter and that visibility. I don't really care about the visibility of it, so I just use something
Yeah.
with a
It's,
lot of
it's got a
big
lot
game
of
has a lot of
stretch.
stretch. Big game has a lot
It
of
does.
stretch.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I switched. I guess we'll jump into like my top water rods, but I switched to monofilament with the top water rods. However, I switched my top water rods from like a moderate fast to like a fast to eat up some of
Oh,
that
sure.
slack.
Yeah.
And it still loads pretty well. I actually I would say on the lighter side, size down a little bit for my top waters,
Are
but
you
go to
throwing
a
medium or
fast
medium?
rod. So a medium.
Medium.
Uh,
Okay.
there's some big top water plugs, Super Spooks, Evergreen Shower Blows,
Yeah.
150, 5, 6, 7 inch top waters.
Hmm.
Uh, but fast rod, a little bit sized down. And then with that mono, man, when it loads up, it's almost like a crankbait. And
Right.
it's tough for them to throw it. I've really enjoyed it. I've tested it over the last like week and a half. And for me, it's it's seeming to work pretty well. It's fitting right in with my, fluorocarbon game with that a little bit of stretch, a little bit of forgiveness, play the
Hmm.
fish, let the rod and line do its work, and just let them swim around. And it works for me. The fish come in. Uh, I don't have a huge hole in their mouth from where I set, a massive hook set, anything like that. They're pinned, and I've done pretty well so far. So I like it. I've definitely enjoyed it. You'll definitely have to try it next time we fish
That's
together.
that's that's interesting. I do pretty much
Yeah.
the opposite, as I throw a more
Okay.
moderate rod.
Okay.
or like a moderate fast rod is what I'll use for the specifically because it'll load more. Um,
So that's your forgiveness with the
for
braid
top
because the
water is
braid
in the
has no
rod, yeah,
stretch. Exactly. So
right,
this is in the rod.
right.
And
But I think I get a little bit more responsiveness because the braid itself has no stretch, so I can snap it and really like
yep.
get a good walk.
Okay. Okay. Interesting.
Yeah,
Interesting.
for like a
Uh,
walking style bait.
yeah, for sure. For
Yeah,
sure. Next thing, we already talked about bending out hooks. We already pretty much covered that.
I don't
Uh,
bend out a lot of hooks. I really don't.
yeah, well, again, you're using a larger size hook
Yeah,
too.
yeah,
Where
larger hook,
I,
EWG.
yeah, when I was doing it, or at least when I was attempting to, I was probably
Mhm.
horrible at it, and I didn't know what I was doing. But for me, I just use the same hooks that I would with like a fluorocarbon, just a 1X round
Sure.
bed standard. And I was
Yeah.
bending out so many hooks, I was getting so frustrated. And I was even loosening my drag to where it was like, I mean, you could pull it off so easily. And I
Yeah.
was still bending out hooks. And I don't know why that is. It was really weird. It's like, it was almost like that instantaneous hit on the hook set would bend
Yeah.
out hooks. And
Huh.
I can't explain it. I don't know. It didn't work for me. It did not work for me at
Hey, it
all.
doesn't work for everyone. One
Yeah.
thing I do, I really like, and this is kind of getting into the weeds here. We talked about this a little
Yes.
bit when I visited, but I like an MBR style or a mag bass kind of taper.
Okay.
It still has a fast tip, but it once you get past the tip, it's pretty soft. I don't
So
really
it
know how to
loads deep
describe
into
it.
the blank.
It it yeah, I guess it does load a little bit deeper than like a JWR, like a jig and worm rod kind of style taper, where they're both fast action, but the tip is a little bit. Yeah, I guess it does load a little bit deeper into the blank. It's yeah, I guess that is kind of the difference there. It's a softer tip. It's not
But
as
not until you apply a load. Is that
not until
correct?
you apply a load. Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. That's pretty cool. I like that. That
Yeah,
sounds like it would work pretty well.
yeah,
Next thing, abrasion resistance. One of my favorites. Braid is not very abrasion resistant.
yeah. It's
I mean,
not.
I touched on this in one of my last videos, but if you put braid under tension against any surface, whether it be a dock, wood, wood's probably the best, but wood, rock, stumps, anything like that, it's liable to fail. It doesn't matter how big the braid is. And that was part of the reason too. I've kind of steered away from it. Is uh, I've had experience losing baits and big fish from rubbing braid against cover and structure, and it snaps like it's nothing. Have you experienced that as well, or not necessarily?
Not no. Most of this time, if I break off, it's at the leader,
Okay,
or not at the connection, not itself, but it's because I didn't retie the leader and the leaders get dinged up.
so it's
Um,
more of a leader problem.
well, it's more of a me not retying problem.
Okay, okay, okay,
uh,
yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
yeah. So
That's good. At
that's
least
more
you're
the issue
honest.
there. That is true though. I mean, braid is not it's not abrasion resistant, and it is. I personally haven't had issues with it, but I think that's lucky more than anything. It
Okay,
is not nearly as abrasion
it's
resistant as like a
it's something to
monofilament
think about.
fluorocarbon.
It's
Yeah,
something to think about, especially in where I was throwing. I started off throwing my big baits with braid leader, 80-pound braid to 30-pound leader, and my leader would be completely fine, and I would break off 80-pound braid on stumps pretty often. Probably I was probably pretty dumb to not change sooner until I lost an expensive bait, but it didn't take much. I mean, even setting a hook on a fish and it was around a stump, it would just snap. And I don't know if I had bad braid. I don't know what was going on, but it was just tough. So that's where for me, I kind of steered away from it. Uh, what about visibility and then sound in the water? What are your thoughts on that?
most of what I do, I don't really care about visibility because the
Okay, because
visibility is so low, anyways.
yeah,
Um, I could definitely see how on a lake like Lanier it makes a big difference. Um, sound in the water, I guess I've never really thought about it. Sound on the reel for sure. If you
yeah,
use like a four carrier or a four strand braid, is a lot louder than a fluorocarbon. So I've switched to mostly an 8 carrier, an 8 strand braid. It's way quieter, way smoother.
Okay.
I've switched almost all my reels to an 8 carrier.
Do you think it makes a difference in the water though? Because
Sound
I have
wise
my
or
opinion on that.
sound, uh, I I don't. I've never thought about it honestly. Sound, I don't think the
Okay.
sound makes a difference. Visibility, I could see definitely making a difference. Um, I would think just because it's thinner, I would think maybe it would be quieter, but I don't know if
Okay.
that's true.
Yeah, I don't know either.
Visibility for sure.
I'm genuinely curious, but
Yeah,
I know I've heard guys on the Bassmaster Elite series switching from sometimes flipping with braid. A lot of guys are now flipping with heavy fluorocarbon because of the sound that braid makes passing over lily pads, grass mats, etc. So I was just curious if you had any
yeah.
thoughts on that.
Never thought about the sound. Visibility, I could see for sure.
Yeah,
Um,
I
for
would agree on that.
like a reaction style, I guess there's a difference though. Is like a for reaction power fishing kind of deal versus like a finesse application. I don't know how much of a difference it makes in power fishing scenario where you're, chucking and winding, or you're really trying to get a true reaction bite out of those fish because they're not studying that lure, looking at it and saying, "Oh, that's something that I want to eat." It's more of an
Right.
instinctual thing where I don't think they care that this bright green line or like just flew past their face because they're not reacting to. They're just kind of lashing out of instinct. I don't think there's a whole lot of thought that
Yeah,
goes into it.
they're locked into
Now,
the bait, not the fishing line
right,
in those reactions
in
in
those
those
kind of
terms.
scenarios.
Yeah,
For like a more finesse application or a slower application, dragging a jig, dragging a shaky head, I could see it being a little bit. I could definitely see where fluorocarbon would be an advantage with visibility there.
for sure. Definitely, yeah. In clear water, you hear a lot of guys go
In
into
clear
that
water.
fluoro for visibility.
Yeah.
So it makes sense. But
Yep.
uh with braid, so let's jump into a couple positives here. With braid, definitely more sensitive.
Yeah.
Tell me about that.
I There's no stretch. I mean, that's kind of the selling point there is there's no stretch. So anything that happens at the end of your line, it's directly transmitted to the tip of your line because there's no stretch at all. Even, I mean, fluorocarbon is very low stretch as compared to monofilament. But even, once you get 50, 60, 70 feet of line out there, that little stretch becomes a pretty big stretch over the course of that line. So I feel like the sensitivity is better with braid because you are more connected to the bait.
Yeah, and you think that helps you or gives you
Yeah,
an advantage?
I can feel um, I think it's easier for me to feel the difference between like wood or rock or mush or when there is a bite. I do think that helps.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I would think it's definitely more sensitive 100%. You can feel way more on the bottom. And it's definitely an advantage. I mean, if you're looking for ultimate sensitivity and that true one-to-one feel, braid, you can't beat it. You really can't. Another thing with braid too is it lasts forever.
For sure.
That's one thing. So if you're looking to get a fishing line, and we kind of circling back to what you started in the beginning, use 30 pound across the board. It's
Everything.
very easy, yeah, to just leave that on there for golly, how many years do you think?
Forever. I mean,
Yeah, yeah,
I've had the same braid on a reel for probably 5 years, 6 years, and it's pretty dingy, but it still works just fine, still catches fish, still yeah, it's it
yeah,
looks
and
kind of ugly, but about it. I mean,
yeah, but it works.
yeah,
And that's the cool thing about braid, I will say, is fluorocarbon is expensive, first of all, to use. It if you're gonna use it for a while, you do need to keep up with it. You need to get a line conditioner and keep up with your fishing line to make sure you reduce the memory, keep it in the best shape possible, and you still have to change it out. Gosh, I probably change my line out on my reels at least twice a year, at least, and it adds up. It adds up very quickly. It definitely can add up. So that's another advantage to braid is you can just sit it on there and let it go. I mean, for years and years and years. It's a little bit more expensive up front, but
yeah.
over the long term, it's way cheaper. Way cheaper, I would argue.
Oh yeah, for sure. I think a spool. like a 150 yard spool, or maybe a 300-yard spool is maybe a bit, I mean, like a 150-yard spool runs about 18 to $20 depending on what you're getting, and a 300-yard spool is probably in that 30 to 35, maybe $40 range, and you can spool up 2 to 3 reels with a 300-yard spool.
Okay. Yeah, and that's about, I mean, I think
Sure,
Fluoro's kind of the same
yeah, but
relatively.
it lasts so much longer that you're not making that
Oh,
same investment every 6
lasts,
months.
yeah, 10 times as long,
Yeah.
easily. Yeah. So definitely an advantage there. Awesome. So, Tom, tell me a little bit about your hook sets and maybe if they're or how they're a little different than per se fluoro or mono.
Yeah, and one thing we keep circling back here to here is braid has no stretch. And so I think that gives you a huge advantage on a long bomber cast, especially for like a crankbait, for example. When a fish bites it, they pretty much hook themselves 9 times out of 10, and you don't have to do a whole lot of work other than just leaning into them because there is no stretch. So it's a direct connection, and there's a lot of pressure on that hook point once they bite it versus something like that has a lot of stretch where you do have to hit them pretty good at the, especially if you're at the end of a really long cast and you try to drive those hooks home, you got to hit them pretty good.
Yeah, you
Um,
see guys all the time literally run almost to the back of their boat to get a hook set. I just did that today actually. But you literally, I mean, you got to eat up, I mean, 6 to 10 feet of stretch, especially with
right.
monofilament. So makes sense.
Yeah, I don't have that issue. They, like I said, most of the time they hook themselves, and by the time I set the hook, I'm just driving the hook in deeper. Or if they don't have it quite yet, I'm getting them pinned. But that's, I mean, I guess a double-edged sword there too, because it is so reactive that, I mean, I guess you could end up pulling it away from them because you don't have that stretch. So I could see that being a downside. But I think I get really good hook sets. Like when I have a hook or when I have a fish bite, a lot of the time I'm able to get a pretty good hook in them.
Okay. So are you more leaning into fish because of that low stretch, or are you still cracking them?
Oh, I
How does
crack
that work?
them. I
Okay.
crack them. I love it.
Okay. That's awesome. That's
Yeah.
good. That makes
I guess
it makes it fun.
it depends what kind of bait we're talking about here too. Like
Yeah.
jigs, Texas rigs, I'm cracking them.
Right.
If it's a
Right.
crankbait, it's more of like a sweeping hook set kind of deal.
Yeah.
Um, and then of course, like super finesse spinning rod applications, I'll kind of lean into them the same, just more pressure than anything. Um, but
So
yeah,
pretty similar to
pretty
what,
similar.
everyone's been taught kind of thing.
Yeah,
Nothing.
same things everyone's been taught. I think I just that lack of stretch helps you to get a better hook in the fish.
Okay. And then you start water skiing them.
And then you wind, baby.
Yeah. I love it. I love it. All right, let's switch gears here and let's kind of jump into fluorocarbon. And I don't want this to be like a braid bashing session. I know we've kind of gone down that road so far, but hopefully we've kind of covered both sides. And like as you guys have heard Tom talk, it works really well for him. If that's the style of fisherman you are, it can work very well. And that's exactly why I brought him on. But fluorocarbon, I'll speak to a little bit here. My first things on the list here were invisibility. We already kind of touched on that. I think it has the perfect amount of stretch. So you've heard us talk about stretch a lot this evening. Stretch has everything to do with sensitivity and forgiveness. So Braid has no stretch, which is very high sensitivity, zero forgiveness. Would you agree with that? I mean,
Yeah, I would. That's a big reason why I use a lot of monofilament leader. Is
yeah,
for that shock absorption for sure. Yeah, you
okay.
don't have a lot of forgiveness. That's your yeah, you're hit the nail on the head.
Cool. And with fluorocarbon, or let's swing all the way to the other side. Monofilament has extremely high stretch, which is a very high level of forgiveness, but very low sensitivity. And I feel that fluorocarbon has the perfect amount of stretch, which is right in the middle. It's kind of like your hybrid, to be honest.
Hmm.
It's kind of a hybrid line. It has stretch. It definitely has stretch, but it's a lot less than mono and it's still very sensitive. And I feel like I haven't missed out on sensitivity where I'm missing fish because of it. Where mono, you could definitely miss bites just because of the amount of stretch. You lose that sensitivity. So for me, I think it's the perfect amount of stretch and it offers that kind of blend between forgiveness and sensitivity. And I think a lot of times that's why I kind of settle on it. It's anyone can use it. If you make a mistake, you can make up for it on fluorocarbon. On braid, sometimes if you make a mistake and that fish is coming at you and he throws his mouth, and there's no stretch, it sometimes can hurt you. It definitely can. Where vice versa with fluorocarbon, sometimes there's too much stretch and you don't get a good hook set if it's at the end of a long cast. So it's just playing that balance, trying to understand, what works best for you.
Mm.
Uh, Again, with fluorocarbon too, another downside we talked about is you have to take care of it a lot more and replace it significantly more often. Over time, fluorocarbon becomes brittle and it will actually shatter, which kind of sounds crazy for a fishing line, but uh, you can look it up on YouTube, but there's actually videos you can see it shattering from stress. So if you have a hook set right at the boat, let's say, and there's not a lot of line out, a lot of stretch, then you can actually shatter fluorocarbon. So it's actually not great for shock absorption. It's really good for abrasion resistance, but it's not great for shock absorption. And so that's why you don't want to use like a braid to fluorocarbon leader, because you would just shatter your leaders because of the no stretch of braid.
Yeah.
Uh, Another thing, and something that I don't know if you do or not, I think this is, I mean, probably just more of a general statement, but with fluoro, you do have to retie often. And I don't know how that is on braid. I think braid's probably way better at that for durability in terms of knots and stuff. But for fluoro, I know for me, the fluoro can actually dig in on itself depending on what knot you use. And then also just from hitting the fish's teeth, it can become a lot weaker after a couple fish. So for me, if I'm in a tournament, I retie almost every time with fluorocarbon, which can get annoying. Uh, but especially also, I'll switch gears here too to big baits. I think just in general, I think if you're throwing a bait that expensive and fishing for fish that large, I think you should do everything in your power to make sure that everything is working properly. And that includes retying after every fish.
Yep.
Uh, but I think even generally with fluoro, you do have to retie significantly more often than with monofilament or braid. Would you agree?
You're talking straight braid?
Yeah, let's go. Let's talk. Go straight braid and then give us mono leader as well. How often are you retying?
Straight braid, hardly ever.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I would agree.
hardly ever.
Yeah.
I don't fish a lot of straight braid. Um, that's a pretty rare application for me where I'll just go
Okay.
straight. Like, I mean, it would be like a punching or like a frog I do straight braid for, but most of the time, even in low visibility situations, I use a leader for the stretch. And
Okay.
I'll cut off and retie that leader as necessary. It's probably about the same as a fluorocarbon. I use a lot of monoliters,
Yeah.
maybe a little bit less than I should.
Yeah. I think we're all guilty of that for
Yeah.
sure. Yeah. I think mono, I mean, mono doesn't have the abrasion resistance of fluorocarbon. But like I said, I've been experimenting with it on my top waters, and the knot strength seems to be stronger in my opinion. I don't have to retie very often at all with mono, and I don't know exactly why that is, but I'm not sure.
I don't know
Uh,
what that is.
yeah, I don't know what that is, but yeah. So those are kind of a few reasons or a few downsides to fluorocarbon. Can you think of any, Tom? I mean, let's flip the script here a little bit. You obviously have settled on Braid the leader. I've settled on fluorocarbon. Give me your opinions on why you don't go fluorocarbon.
The biggest reason is the maintenance is a pain in the butt. Like you said, you've got to replace it so often. That's that's the biggest reason I don't do it.
Okay.
I like
Is it
being
more of a
able.
time or money thing?
It's a money thing.
Yeah.
I don't mind putting in the time. I mean, I
Okay.
was earlier tonight. I was fidgeting with a bunch of hooks on my
Yeah.
jerk baits, get them to float right. But no, it's a money thing. And the other thing I really like about braid is we talked about this very briefly at the start, but I can take a 30-pound braid tie on a 10-pound leader and go fish clear water. Um, or I can take that same 30-pound braid, tie on a 20-pound leader and fish super muddy water. So I don't have to have different reels spooled up with different lines. I can just tie on a leader, have it on that pretty much the same rod, and be good to go. And I can use that for a ton of different applications.
Yeah, the versatility, 100%, 100%. Yeah, and I think that too. I mean, that's again back to the money thing. If you're just getting out there, maybe you're just a pond fisherman, or you only, are just trying to test things out with fishing. You want to pick up one or two rods. I'd have a tough time, steering someone away from braid to leader for that exact reason, because you can change that rod into whatever combo that you need it to be. And also, that's going to save you a lot of money. As you mentioned, you don't have to have a ton of different reels. Like I've got, I think, 4 reels sitting on my workbench right now without rods, with just different lines on them, which again is a cost. It's a cost that I'm not using them. So you have to have a bunch of different rods and reels, and it can definitely add up. It can definitely add up. Anything else, or those kind of the two big things?
Um, no, that's pretty much it. I've been thinking about making the transition to fluorocarbon for of my one of my reels, rods and reels. Um, but I really can't think of an application that I would use straight fluorocarbon for that I can't use braid to leader for. I can fish all through the water column. I can use top water. I can do bottom contact. I can do reaction baits. Um, the maybe if I was going to switch one, I would
Yeah,
switch to straight fluoro for jerk baits
okay.
because it sinks and
Yeah, good
the
point.
the
I didn't,
the
yeah,
action of a jerk bait is very specific where you need to have it suspended. Um,
yes.
that's probably the only time that I would go to. If I had to pick one application that I think fluorocarbon is definitively superior, it's probably jerkbait fishing.
Okay.
You can throw it braid to leader, you can, um,
So
but
you're saying just to control the depth rate and the suspension rate of that jerk
the
bait.
depth, I think it's less. Especially, I think a lot of the modern jerk baits they're so finely tuned that the braid floating or the mono leader floating
Yeah,
is going to throw it off just enough that it might cause it to get a very slow rise. Whereas I think a lot of them are designed around being thrown on fluorocarbon specifically so that they stay exactly where they're supposed to in the water.
I would agree. I would agree. And you can see, I mean, on forward facing, if you have forward facing, but if you watch your jerk bait, those fish will be
Gator
much more
vision.
aggressive. Yeah, 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 yeah. But those fish will be much more aggressive when that bait hangs in their face versus floats away from them. And I'm sure you guys have probably heard that before in other videos, but we won't kind of jump into that from there. But that's a good point. That's definitely a good point. I forgot to make that. Um, anything else off the top of your head that you can think of that maybe good, bad, ugly for either line?
Um, braid deleter, good, no stretch. I think you get a ton of sensitivity out of it. We talked about that. Bad, kind of the same deal, no stretch. So you do have to change up the way that you play fish a little bit, um, and kind of be cognizant of that. The ugly, yeah, I don't know if there's anything ugly. Honestly, the ugly I think is mostly mental because when people talk about fishing braid, they freak out because they're like, "Oh, I'm going to lose it's there, it's visible, it's uh like I'm going to lose so many bites because of these highly pressured fish and they're going to see the braid and it's going to throw them off." Maybe that is true for super clear water. For the vast majority of fishing is going to across the country, right? I know the vast majority of what you do is in linear, so that is super clear water. But across the country, the vast majority of fishermen, clear water is 5 feet, 3 feet visibility is clear water.
Yeah, for sure.
So I think in most of what you're going to be doing, the visibility doesn't make a big difference, and it's just a mental block to get over.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, a lot of it's mindset. And I
It
lost my
is.
mindset with Braid the Leader a while ago. So that's probably why it doesn't work for me. But
That's a great thing. What works for one person doesn't work for another, and vice versa. And that's what makes it fun. Is everyone's got their own style,
it does. Yeah, and it works. It
and it
definitely
works.
works.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Well, thank you, Tom. Thanks for hopping on. I appreciate it. Hopefully, you guys learned something from him on Braid to Leader. Like I said, he is much more well versed than I am in that regard. I know how to do everything wrong in that area. So hopefully, you guys learned about how to tune your setup, how to tune your rods and reels, and go out and catch some fish on Braid to Leader. If you like this video, drop a comment down below. Ask questions. We'll answer anything that you guys have for either setup. But go out there, give it a try. Try Braid to Leader. Let me know what you guys think, and I'll see you guys in the next one.
Thanks for having me, Cam. This is a blast, man.
Yeah, for sure, Tom. Thanks.